What do we mean by food when we ask the question if food can be art? If food is seen as cooking, we could say, then obviously it is art, because it involves the creative act of mixing together its components and subjecting them to different types of processing. It can be arranged on the plate in a way that is very similar to designing a college or making a sculpture. Nonetheless, there seems to subsist a fundamental difference that distinguishes culinary products from paintings, sculptures, or music. In fact, however unpleasant might a life without art be, it is impossible to die of the lack of aesthetic experience, while food is directly related to physiology and absolutely necessary for a man to survive. For this reason, even if food can be said to have an aesthetic value in the first place, we are also attracted to it by purely physiological forces that are difficult to separate from the disinterested pleasure we take in looking at art. This is exactly what the interest exclusion thesis defended by Kant and others maintains. Let's start with some questions. Is it possible, in matter of food and beverages, being disinterested? What does it mean, being disinterested, when applied to food? How to comment Adria's statement, people does not come to El Bulli to eat, but to have an aesthetic experience? The first important problem here is the one concerning our appreciation. Kant sees aesthetic appreciation as a disinterested interest. In fact, he maintains that we do not, in viewing a painting, want to consume or own it, and we are not satisfying a desire in the same way as we do when eating. In the critique of judgment, Kant maintains that judgment of taste are both subjective and universal. They are subjective because they are responses of pleasure, and do not essentially involve any claims about the properties of the object itself. But in the meantime, they are universal and not merely personal. That's because, in a crucial way, they must be disinterested. When I am appreciating a painting aesthetically, I'm not thinking about how much money it's worth, or whether it is a portrait of a family member, or even about who painted it. The terrible problem food presents for a Kantian perspective is that it seems to have a too strong instrumental value. We cannot really appreciate aesthetically food, and consequently food cannot be a work of art, because we need food in order to survive. Okay, Kant says that the aesthetic judgment needs to consider objects' intrinsic value and not its instrumental value. But the point is, from the fact that an artwork has an intrinsic value, it does not follow that it cannot have an instrumental value too. Let's briefly remember the example Nelson Goodman gives in his Ways of Word Making. We could use a painting by Rembrandt to stop up a broken glass. In this case, clearly, the painting would have an instrumental value, but this wouldn't change its intrinsic qualities. The Kantian problem concerns the objective judgment about the merits and demerits of art objects. If the object has qualities valuable for their own sake, and not for the sake of anything else, it seems to allow one to consider its qualities on the grounds alone, free from instrumental temptations. But is this true? Is it true that in order to have objective judgments, we need to focus only on the intrinsic qualities of an object? And even if true, couldn't we focus on the intrinsic qualities of an object having, in addition, also an instrumental value? I could eat something just for its tastiness, being in an aesthetic frame of mind, whereas I can simply eat because I'm hungry, then considering the object exclusively in its instrumental value. It seems that we are able to approach eating from an aesthetically minded standpoint, and that we are able to single out qualities of also functional objects for purely qualitative appreciation. Hence, it seems possible to have disinterested experiences of objects that have additional uses, and food cases are an evidence for this. Let's now try to consider the second thesis, defended by Hegel and others, concerning consumption. According to the consumption exclusion thesis, food should be dismissed as a genuine artistic medium, on the grounds that the object of culinary art is consumed as it is enjoyed. A cake exists only as long as we do not eat it, whereas proper art objects exist forever or for a long period of time. This is the thesis based on the idea that genuine art is timeless and also raises a question for what concerns the object's identity. Normal artistic objects, as paintings and sculptures, are created and do persist, but culinary objects clearly seem to be different. Is persistence a necessary condition for genuine art objects? If so, clearly there's a problem, since the persistent condition does not seem to be satisfied by culinary objects. The act of eating destroys and alters the particular object of our gustatory delight. Should we then conclude that culinary objects failing the consumption exclusion thesis are not proper art objects? In order to defend the idea that culinary objects may legitimately be considered as art objects, we need to challenge this thesis, as we have already done with the interest exclusion thesis. How to challenge this thesis? By considering 2 points. First, that CET, consumption exclusion thesis, depends upon a dubious conception of artistic objects. Second, we need to explain how culinary art can and does persist beyond its consumption. Are all legitimate works of art primarily materially composed? No. It is not difficult to find examples of artistic objects depending as much upon immaterial conditions for their existence as they do on their material components. It is enough to think about music, theater, and dance, or in general to all performance arts. Think about Salvetti's performance outside. CET does not consider performance arts, that is, arts depending on their structure more than they do on material conditions. In performance arts, typically, the imposed structure is distinct from the material components in which or by which it manifests. In other words, the structure is distinct from any particular material instance. And it is precisely by recognizing the formal structure of the performance that we are able to identify it. Hence, a persistent condition founded on numerical identity for this kind of art objects is too strong. Let's follow again Goodman's suggestion distinguishing autographic from allographic arts. Culinary objects share a kind of formal structuring that parallels that found in performance arts. But instead of calling it a score, a choreography, or a script, we call it a recipe. The recipe structures the way in which food elements are combined, thus affecting an overall object of our appreciation. The recipe makes the dish exactly the dish that it is, and the structure is distinct from the ingredients in which it manifests. A culinary art object is the unique combination of a set of material ingredients with a formalized method of preparation, where the formalized method is the recipe which structures the ingredients such that they compose the given dish. As happens with musical melodies, culinary objects too are characterized by something over and above the ingredients, which can account for their persistence. We eat the instance, the particular, and not the recipe, the universal. In this way, the consumption problem is overcome. What is a recipe? The way in which a dish is recorded or symbolized somehow. According to the principle of universalization, we should treat like cases alike. Given the similarity between culinary objects and performance art objects, consider as examples the performances by Marina Abramovic and Tino Segal, and given the fact that the performance art objects count as proper art objects, we can classify culinary objects as proper objects of art. Needless to say, there subsist also important differences as for instance Nicola Perullo this morning underlined, between food and performance arts. Food is eaten while performance arts are not. Food has a nutritive value over and above its aesthetic properties, and so on. So now, after having found arguments both against IET and CET, what kind of definition of art object should we propose? We would like to suggest a definition that may solve this problem and similar ones. It is a definition able to solve the classical questions posed by the so-called unconventional works of art. Our thesis is that such a definition may help to clarify why these objects, among which we include food, could be considered, in particular conditions, as works of art. This does not mean saying that everything or every kind of food may be a work of art in every condition, of course. First of all, it is important to note that the category we generally label as food is a very broad one, including at least 3 different kinds of objects. That's why the question becomes the following. Are all objects we usually and generically define as food works of art? The straight answer is no, or at least not necessarily. Under the label food, we generally include, first, natural objects, things like tomatoes, potatoes, vegetables, and so on. B, artifacts, such as pasta, bread, pizza, wine. And third, works of art, that is the category we need characterized in relation with food. The most interesting cases are those in which the same object could be positioned in the meantime in all these 3 different categories. Let's consider a tomato. The very same tomato can be 3 different kinds of objects, or can be stored, we would say in philosophy, in 3 different categories, depending on certain external condition. It may be a natural object, an artifact, a work of art. Take a closer look. The first case is simple. A tomato on the plant is a natural object, that is, an object produced by nature. In the majority of cases, natural objects as such are not works of art, but they may become artifacts in a very simple way. Let us now consider a second tomato. It is indiscernible from the first one, and thence from the same plant. This is a particular plant. It is, let's suppose, in an apartment, and the landlord uses it as an ornament for his marvelous balcony. The plant has been removed from the soil and planted in a large yellow pot. Finally, the pot was assembled with other pots of different colors and shapes. The result is a beautiful roof garden, a kind of impressionist painting for the observer who knows the history of modern painting. As it is, the landlord uses the roof garden as a pleasant and nice place where to take refuge from his busy life. Let's now consider a more complex case, a third tomato, whose properties are indiscernible from the previous one, but with a different destiny. The landlord loves the tomato plants in his garden and is also a lover of the well-known cocktail, the Bloody Mary. The night in which our story takes place, it's a freezing one, and the man, whose name is Henry, has finished all the tomatoes in his fridge, and he does not feel like going out to buy more tomatoes. So, regretfully, he takes a tomato from the plant. He then squeezes it with 2 parts of vodka. We now have 2 different variations to our scenario. In the first one, Henry is a concrete man. He drinks when he's thirsty and eats when he's hungry. When possible, he prefers to take the tomatoes he needs from the fridge, but in case this is not possible, he makes do. He doesn't know the history of the Bloody Mary. All he knows is that once a friend made such a drink for him. He still remembers the recipe, 3 parts tomato and 2 of vodka. The memory of that superb beverage helps him in reproducing that drink without making significant changes from the original recipe. Let us now turn to the second scenario. Here, Henry is a totally different man. He is very sophisticated and chooses the tomato he needs for his cocktail with great attention. He knows that there have to be more than 5 drops of Tabasco, and he also knows that it is fundamental to use the right kind of lemon. Perhaps one from Sicily, but not a too ripe one. Quite often he uses vodka instead of gin. He prefers gin due for the juniper berries, which give the juice a very particular and special taste. To those who ask him why he loves the cocktail so much, he usually answers that it is because of the color, whose intensity remembers paintings by Tiziana, and because of his strong and vigorous taste, which is the sign of its character. And finally, because of the legend of Bloody Mary, the Queen. For these reasons, he loved to prepare the cocktail, but in his own way. Now, let us return to our scenarios. Our theory is that the drink in the third scenario is food transfigured in an artwork. That is, it is something which has the same ontological structure of an artwork. How might this structure be described? A useful concept is that of semantic vehicle. In the second example, food is used as a semantic vehicle, that is, a vehicle of the representations of the producer of the Bloody Mary. In all our examples, the tomatoes are indiscernible. In spite of this, in the first case we have a natural object, in the second case the tomato is an ingredient of the Bloody Mary recipe. It becomes an artifact. In other words, a natural object intentionally modified by the author of the cocktail. Finally, Henry's Bloody Mary is an authentic work of art. That is, it is a recipe whose properties are intentionally modified following a particular idea, Henry's idea. This idea depends partially from Henry's creativity, partially from the history of cuisine, and partially from the tastes of people living in the place where Henry lives. The second Bloody Mary, differently from the first one, is a work of art because whereas the first embodies a series of meanings deposited in the history of cuisine by the first producer of the cocktail and revisited and recreated by Henry, in the second case, we also have a revisited, at least partially, cocktail's taste by changing the physical composition of the cocktail. Clearly, all these conditions work only when kept together as a bundle. None of these considered alone is either necessary nor sufficient. Let us return to our previous questions. Can food be art? The answer is yes, in some particular cases. Is all food art? The answer is no, for the reason explained above. Our idea is that a good definition has to involve a bundle of conditions regarding the physicality of the object, the intentionality of the producer, and the history of the practice in which the object is involved. The answer to the questions posed by the second Bloody Mary is in the bundle of properties which differentiate the second from the first one, and that concerns partially the material composition of the cocktail and partially the intentionality of the man producing it. This brings us to our last point. In order to understand what a work of art is, we cannot overlook neither the knowledge of the recipe nor a piece of modern history and a bit of psychology. When then can food be a work of art? In all those cases in which it is a social object, an artifact that embodies a representation in the form of an inscribed trace upon a medium that is not transparent. Thank you.